Today's daf we're going to learn is daf Lamed Sukkah Lamed Vav. Today's daf is dedicated by Emma Rimberg in memory of her beloved mom Marjorie Glick, Miriam Chana bat Menachem Mendel and Rachel on the occasion of her stone setting in Shloshim. May her precious neshama glow brightly in the schut of our learning together. And by Terry Kravosha for the refuah shlema of her dear friend Elisheva bat Ora. We're going to start today at the top. I want to just go back to, we saw the etrog that was peeled, and then we said lokasha habakula habamiktsata. We mentioned that there was a debate about which direction this goes. Is it better to be entirely peeled, or is it better to be only partially peeled? And having anyway, we talked about that yesterday. We're going to move on to the next one. Nistak nikev. Tani ula barchinina nikev nekev mifulash b'mashu v'she'enu mifulash b'ki'isal. If you have a hole that goes through only on one side, then, on both sides, nekev mifulash, it goes on both sides. Remember the mavoi mifulash? It was open on both sides. Here we have a hole that goes through on both sides, even here. And I'll kind of tell you that the theme of today's daf is multiple opinions about how to understand each thing. We're going to see very different opinions about all sorts of things. Some people say nekev mifulash as it goes through on both sides. Some people said it goes through the membrane all the way to the inside, and eno mifulash is only on the outer edge. So nikev nekev mifulash b'mashu, any size. V'she'eno mifulash, if it doesn't go through all the way, or again, it doesn't go through all the way to the inside, then b'ki'isal, which we saw before with the sun. Remember, it diffuses and it's like a zuz, and then an isar is a coin. So the size of that coin. By Rava. Rava asked the following question. Here again, they compare it. We saw the comparison to the animals, ba'alei mumim, blemished animals, etc. Now we're going to compare all these treifa. An animal that's a treifa is an animal that is going to, or the typical definition in Chulin, although not everybody agrees, is that it will die within the next 12 months. And there's all sorts of signs as to what's a treifa. And any animal that's like that can't be slaughtered to be eaten. It's not a kosher animal. That's where the word treif comes from. Treif really means not able to be slaughtered, not necessarily not kosher. It's a kosher animal, but has signs of something wrong with it, some sickness. So now they want to know which simanei treifa are you referring to in this question that Rava asked. What's the question? If it's that it's peeled off, which let's say you have an animal whose hide is all off, that would be a sign of a treifa. So here we have the peel of the etrog is off. Tanina, that already appeared in the Mishnah. Rava wouldn't be asking a question like that. Inistak. If you want to say it has a crack along the length of it, the etrog, and that's like if you have on the tracheal, the trachea, if it has a slit down the middle of it, that also, and then we're going to say a slit like that, likewise a slit on the etrog, tanina, we already learned that. Any cave, if it gets a hole punctured through it, tanina, that also appeared in our Mishnah. Right, remember we talked about the nekev by the stomach of the animal. So it must have been his question was, as Ula says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, if you have a lung that got liquefied, and now it's like a pitcher that you could pour stuff out. In other words, everything kind of gets melted, it gets to this liquefied, right, which is obviously not a good thing. Kshira. Okay, so it says by a treifa, it's actually okay if it liquefies inside this lung. That's if the bronchia in the lungs are still intact. If it's liquefied inside, but the bronchia are still intact, then it's okay. But if the bronchia are not intact, then it's a treifa. So now they want to know, if we have something similar in an etrog where the inside becomes liquefied, what would be the situation? Here's Rava's question. Dilma hatamhu delo shali ba'avira hadrabari. There's no air that gets to it. It's not exposed to the elements. And therefore, hadrabari, it would go back to, it would, if the bronchia are still intact, it could heal. Aval hacha de shali ba'avira. But in our case, where the air is exposed to it because it's in the etrog, then, right, we're going to assume, I guess, even though it does have a peel, but they're going to assume that it's, in our case, the air can get to it. Therefore, siruche masrachat. Okay, we would say in our case, it will rot very quickly. And do we say that, Odil Maloshna, or do we say really there's no difference between them? So that's Rava's question. And for an answer, they bring the following source. Tashma, we're going to see a whole bunch of different things. We're going to try to answer our question from it, and then we're going to go in depth into some of the things we're mentioning here. Etrog tapuach, which means not a tapuach, or it actually is tafuach, which is swollen, an etrog that's swollen, or saruch, which is rotten. Okay, now we're going to have to figure out what is rotten. Is rotten exactly the case we're talking about? And then we'd have an answer. Kavush, if it's pickled, shaluk, cooked, kushi, dark. Okay, kushi generally refers to someone who comes from Eretz Kush, which is Ethiopia. The people there are dark. Therefore, we're saying it's a term. We're going to actually discuss this. There's a big debate about what this etrog kushi. Everyone agrees that the etrog kushi is a dark etrog. Okay, whether it's exactly black or not is a debate. Why it's called a kushi, there's actually a bit of a debate. Some people say because it looks like a kushi, or some people say it's because it comes from the land of Kush. They also had darker etrogim, which is hard to imagine, but possibly. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit when the Gemara gets into it. Lavan, if it's white, which is also not the right color. Minumar, if it's leopardy, right, where it has different spots on it. We talked about that before. All these are pasul. Etrog kikadur, if you have an etrog that's like a ball, it's rounded, right? Or etrogim are not rounded. Pasul, it's disqualified. The yesh omrim afatiyom. Some people say even if it's a double, like a Siamese etrog, we know sometimes you get fruits like that, like a banana where there's two together. So if you have an etrog like that, it would be disqualified. Some people actually debate whether this is because it's like two. Some people say that we're talking about if you had two together and you severed them, even the individual ones would be disqualified. Because notice it's only yesh omrim, not everyone agrees. And that's why they say it seems strange. If you had this double one, of course it should be disqualified. Everyone should agree about that. Etrog habosel, which is one that's unripe. Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshirim. So Rabbi Akiva says it's no good. The rabbis allow it. Gidlo batfus v'asao kimim bria acheret. If you had it growing inside a mold and it came out in a shape that made it look like it was something else. There's actually an interesting debate here about whether it actually has to resemble some other fruit for it to be disqualified. Or like, let's say it could not look like an etrog, but it also doesn't resemble anything else. Because this says it looks like something else, some people say it's only if it looks like another fruit. If it doesn't look like another fruit and it just looks like nothing, that would still count as your etrog. But if it shape it in a shape that looks like something else, other people say no, as long as it doesn't look like an etrog, it's a problem. Katani miyad. So now that's the end, right? So if it's like that, pasul, disqualified. Now we go back. Why do we bring this? So Rava had asked this question. Is it like this case of the lungs that had liquefied, where it really depends and it's not necessarily disqualified? Or do we say here, since the air can get to it, it's going to rot very quickly and it's more problematic? So now they say, tafuach v'saruch, it said, right? Remember, swelled and rotten. My love. Now, why is there a difference? Because if it swells, it's rotten, and if it's rotten, it's swelled. That's the assumption of this, even though it's not really true, but that's the assumption, the first working assumption, which they're going to correct soon. But assuming that, they say, my love, tafuach mi bachutz, v'saruach mi bifnim. Is it not that it's swollen from the outside, and saruach is from the inside, and then that would show even rotten on the inside will be a problem. So they say, lo, idi v'idi mi bachutz v'lo kasha. So then they say, no, it's not true. You could really say that both are mibifnim, that both are from the both are from the outside. And the difference is one is it's swelled without rotting, and one is it rotted without swelling. As we said before, that could possibly be an option. Okay, I'm just checking one thing. Yeah. Okay, now moving on. So now that we mentioned this source, Amar, we now want to get into more details. Etrog kushi pasul, v'hatanya. But wait, doesn't it say in a braita, kushi kashel, domele kushi pasul? A kushi itself is a problem. If it's like a kushi, it's disqualified. What does it mean like a kushi? So this is a big debate, what exactly this means. Let's start with Rashi. I think Rashi says, Domel kushi shegadel kand v'hareu shachor. One could say if it grew in Kush and it was dark, since that's what typically grows in Kush, that's normal. But if it grows in Babylonia, let's say, where the etrogim never grow that way, and it looks like a Kushi, right? That's a problem because it's not right. Whereas the one that grows in Kushi is actually fine. And that's going to contradict this source that said a Kushi is a problem. That's one way to read it. Some people say Kushi is dark and Domela Kushi is black, really dark. Okay, it's where it's worse than the Kushi, right? You would think similar to a Kushi sounds actually a little better maybe, but no, they say maybe that means black. Again, there's many different ways to read this line. In any case, it seems to contradict because it says a Kushi is actually okay. And in this Braita we saw before said a Kushi was a problem. So Amar Abai, Ki Tananami Matnitin Domele Kushi Tanam. When our Mishnah said, sorry, not our Mishnah, our source that we quoted, Etrog Tafuach Saruach Kavush Shaluk Kushi, it meant Domele Kushi, whatever Domele Kushi is, according to whatever interpretation you go by. Rava gives a different explanation, and this gets off on a very interesting thing in the commentaries. Lo kashya, halan halahu. There's really no debate here. That's for them, and this is for us. Okay, or that's for us. Lan is lanu. This is for them. Now, whenever this comes up in the Gemara, generally it means Babylonians are us versus the ones living in Eretz Yisrael, which are them. And then you have this big issue. So first of all, whenever you see halan, halahu, again, the Gemara doesn't tell you which is Israel, which is Babylonia. You don't really know. So let's start looking at the commentary. So Rashi says, halan, halahu, la'olam matnitin kushinami pasul, v'lo kasha, matnitin l'bnei Eretz Yisrael, sherichokim me'eretz kush, ve'enam regilim bahem. He says, the ones in Israel live far from Ethiopia, and therefore they're not used to them. But the Braita that we saw, the second source, is Libnei Vavel. Shekorim lekush urigilim bahem. Krovim lekush. They're near Ethiopia and they're used to that. And therefore, right, and he says, Umikoma komagadel kam b'domeh lekushi nidmehu pasul. Obviously, if it grows here, okay, and it looks like a kushi, so, right, then it's a problem. So basically, Rashi is going to say that it depends where you're living. Okay, I just want to read some really interesting source about this Rashi, because the people in Israel live far from Ethiopia, and because of that, they weren't familiar with these. And the people in Babylonia lived close, and therefore it wasn't an issue. So the Rashash comes and talks about this, and the Rashash says that it's a super commentary on Rashi, or at least he often comments on Rashi, not exactly super commentary, but often comments on Rashi. And he says, Kush is actually closer to Israel than it is to Babylonia. So this answer of Rashi doesn't make much sense, okay? Because, right, Bavel is where Iraq is, and it's farther from Ethiopia. And therefore he says it could be that just the roads, right, the travel didn't allow in those days from Ethiopia to Israel, and maybe that's why. And he raises possible answers to why Rashi would have said, now, what's the issue here? Rashi didn't really understand the geography. He didn't live there. They didn't have great maps, I guess. And he didn't, or maybe he wasn't up on all the maps and how exactly the geography works. Anyway, this is an interesting question, right? It's an interesting historical thing about people who try to explain without actually understanding the terrain. So he assumes that that's how it splits, and that's how we say it. However, there's other explanations. And one of the interesting explanations I came across is I just want to open it, is that, right, Rabbi Shimshon Mishantz says that it actually, halan halahu, means something different here. By the way, I think that there are those who explain it in the reverse, if I remember correctly. I just want to see, right. So other people try to resolve this by saying that it's not necessarily that it comes from, right, that one is closer or one is not closer, but in Israel, it's just less common to have the darker ones, and therefore a kushi that that grows there is disqualified, whereas in Babylonia, they're used to darker ones, and therefore it's not so strange. Has nothing to do with geography or anything else. But the most interesting is Rabbi Shimshon Mishan's. Why is it most interesting? Halan Halahu always means Babylonia and Israel. But he suggests, in this case, what is lan and lahu? Lan is them, and lahu is us. So you generally assume that when we're in the Talmud Bavli, they're referring to Babylonians versus Eretz Israel people, because that's the two main centers. But he claims no. Lan means the people, that's us, everyone, other than people living in the land of Cush. If you're living in the land of Cush, then that's your typical thing, and therefore it's okay. Again, this all has to assume that Cush means it comes from the land of Cush, rather than it's just dark like the people who live there are, right? Then obviously you're going to have a different explanation. That more matches, maybe the second explanation we saw, that it was just a matter of in Babylonia, they sometimes they had darker ones, and in Israel they didn't, and therefore it would be like this. So then you would say, right, that it's if you're living in Cush and it's what you're normally used to, then that would be the case versus what you're not. This, by the way, all talks about, beauty is in the hands of the beholder. I forget what it is, but it's right. It's that it all depends what you're used to. Everything is subjective here. When we talk about hadar and beauty, it's all subjective. It all depends on what your perspective is. So if you're used to something, then it's beautiful to you. If you're not used to it, then it looks very odd and it stands out and you say, this is very strange. So there's all different there's a very interesting sugya in terms of that. Etrog habosel. In etrog, that's unripe. Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshirim. So again, Rabbi Akiva says no good. Chachamim say it's okay. Amar Rabba, Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbi Shimon amru davar echad. Rabba says that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon are actually in the same shita. Why? They say the same opinion. So where do we see this? This is an idea. We saw this in the beginning about all these rabbis hold dirat keva be'ina, and then we gathered all these different sources where somebody said this, somebody said that, and they all really are coming down to the same concept. Likewise here, so Rabbi Akiva said an unripe etrog is no good. Rabbi Shimon, where does Rabbi Shimon say this? So obviously he says it somewhere else, otherwise it would be obvious that they hold the same thing, and you wouldn't need Rabbi to tell you this. So he says, Rabbi Shimon poter et etrogim bekotnan. The topic here is not etrog for minim, for the four species. The topic is etrog when it comes to taking maaser, from tithing the produce. Do you have to take maaser from an etrog that's still too small and it's not big enough, it hasn't ripened? So Rabbi Shimon says you don't. Likewise, same thing. Rabbi Akiva says this is no good for the mitzvah of etrog. So Amalei, so it's the same concept. But Abaye says, Amalei Abaye, he says to Rabba, Dilmalohi, why do you assume this is the same machloket? One is maaser, one is the mitzvah of arba minim. Those are not the same thing. Dilmalohi, maybe it's not the case. Ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Akiva hatam debinan hadal, the leka. There, by four minim, it needs to be beautiful. And this isn't beautiful because it's not ripe yet. But hatam ki Rabbanan sfira lahu. But maybe when it comes there, he holds like the rabbis that it's fine. Maaser doesn't need beauty. So what's the difference if it's unripe? Inami, alternatively, and that's a way to say that Rabbi Akiva wouldn't necessarily agree with Rabbi Shimon. Now we want to show that Rabbi Shimon wouldn't necessarily agree with Rabbi Akiva. How so? Inami, Rabbi continues, alternative, also you could say, Aghan lo ka'amar Rabbi Shimon hatam ela dichtiv, aser ta'aser kol tfuat zaracha. Take tithes on all the tfuah, all the crops growing in your seeds, tfuat of your seeds. So therefore, what's going to be relevant? Kederech shebnei adam motzi'im lizri'ah. It would be fruits that you could take the seeds of and plant them. And if the fruit isn't ripened, you can't take the seeds from there and replant them. So therefore, it wouldn't be liable you wouldn't have to take the tithes, but you could say when it comes to the etrog, you would actually hold like the rabbis in this case, where you wouldn't hold like Rabbi Akiva and you would say it's no good. So that's a possible way of reading it, in which case we can't necessarily say that that's the situation. And comes the Gemara and says, or Abaye, and says, Fitulo midi. And conversation is closed. There's no other way to see it other than this way. I'm right. Conversation ended. Okay, this comes up once in a while in a debate between the rabbis, Vitulo midi and end of topic. Don't start arguing with me. Next case, gadlo b'dfus. Again, we're on that source that we brought before. That's quoting all different types of etrogim that are disqualified. Gadlo b'dfus. If you put it in a mold, v'as'o k'min b'reya acheret psula, it would have to look like some other type. It would be disqualified. Amarava lo shanu ela k'min b'reya acheret, aval k'briyato kasher. So he says only if it looks like something else, but if it looks like itself, it's good. So then the Gemara says, pshita, that's very obvious. Obviously, if it looks like itself, it's good. Why would you even think it would be a problem? So they say, lo tzricha de'avid, right? Pshita kemimbria acheret. And it's Tanya, it says in that braita, kemimbria acheret. So obviously, it would have to look like something else. Lo tzri, or wouldn't look like an etrog. Lo tzricha de'avide dape dape. Well, it's to come teach you if it looks like. Okay, again, different explanations what this means. Let's just look what Rashi says. Rashi says, kimin, the second line in Rashi, kimin kashim kashim. Okay, it looks like beams in it. Now, what's a lulav? What's an etrog with beams? It has ridges in it. Sometimes you get an etrog and it has these ridges and they almost look like, right, it goes in a little bit and then you end up with it looks like strips all around. So if you did a mold and it came out looking like that, that would still be okay. And that's why Rava says to you, Lo shanu ela k'min bria acheret. But if it looks like itself with, maybe some ridges in it, but it's still kind of the shape of an etrog, then it's fine. Itma. Now we're going to talk about etrog shenikvu achbarim. Okay, now you would say at first glance, this would obviously be problematic. If mice ate into the etrog, of course that's disqualified, right? Well, let's see. Amarav ein ze hadal. Rav says, like you would expect, this is not beautiful, right? This is ugly. A mouse ate away at your etrog. Of course, it's a problem. We're going to see two versions of this sugya. So this is the first one. So now this is going to get a little strange. Ini, is that really true? Rabbi Chanina mat bilba v'nafikba. Rabbi Chanina would dip his etrog, which really means he would dip it into something and eat it. He would eat his etrog, v'nafikba, and he'd be yotze with that etrog. He ate away parts of his etrog and still used it for the mitzvah. This is an insane concept that Rabbi Chanina really did this. And the Mepharshim jump on this and say, what the heck are you talking about? How could he possibly have eaten his etrog and also used it for the mitzvah? So they come up with all different explanations. I'm hesitant to bring them because they're all kind of apologetic answers. It's very hard to really see all of them answer. Like I'll give you one of the answers that at least to me seem the closest, which is it talks about in another source, which we'll get to, the Anshe Yerushalayim that walk around all day with their etrogim and lulavim in their hands. So they would always take it all day long. So some people say he fulfilled the mitzvah in the morning and then would walk around with it all day. And sometimes then in the afternoon, he might take a bite out of it, but would still carry it around with him. Hard to say this because it actually says he would eat it and he would use it to fulfill the mitzvah. We don't really understand what Rabbi Chanina was doing and how he did this, but we have to just take it as an assumption that somehow he ate a piece of it and was still using it for the mitzvah somehow. So to which the Gemara says, so why, if mice eat through it, is it a problem? But if people eat through it, it's not a problem. So to which they say, Ulu Rabbi Chanina kashi matnitin. So first they answer, the Mishnah doesn't work with Rabbi Chanina, because we said if it's missing a part, it's a problem, right? Remember, in the cave, make a hole, it's missing part, it's a problem. So first of all, how did he do this? So Bishlama matnitin le Rabbi Chanina lo kashya. Kam b'yom tov rishon, kam b'yom tov sheni. Rabbi Chanina never uses the word hadal. You could say that Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina could say that the Mishnah, when it says if it's missing part, that's in the first day because you need lekichatama. Remember, lekachtem, the last two words are tem, right, which really means you should take, but they darshan tama, which means complete. It's not complete. That would only be on day number one. Rabbi Chanina would do this on the subsequent days when you no longer need lekichatama because it's not the first day. You still do need hadar, but he didn't view this in the world of beauty. He thought it was still okay within beauty. It just wasn't complete. So we say kam b'yom tov rishon, kam b'yom tov sheni, right? So again, the Rabbi Chanina was the subsequent days, whereas the Mishnah was talking about day number one. Again, you see Yom Tov Sheni when it really means the end of the rest of a holiday. Elel Rav, but Rav says, if an achbarim made holes in it, it's not hadar, which means it would be a problem all the days of the holiday. So Amar Rav would answer, Shane achbarim de mi'ise. The difference between Rabbi Hanina eating it and mice eating it, think about it. If you come across something, okay, let's assume it's not during the time of COVID where you're a little more crazy about germs. But let's say you're not a crazy germ freak and somebody leaves something over. If somebody bit out of something, you might actually come and eat it. But if you knew that mice ate it, you certainly wouldn't go anywhere near it. And that's why Rav says this isn't hadar, even though a person eating it would be hadar. Okay, that's the whole first way of reading this sugya. Some people say, though, that Amarav zeh hadar. Rav says, even if mice ate through it, this is still beautiful. That's a little harder to understand. And how does he know this? But now he uses Rabbi Hanina to prove his point. Rabbi Hanina, and therefore we know since he did it, he would eat it and use it for the mitzvah. Therefore, it seems like even mice eating it would be fine. Well, the Rabbi Hanina kasha matnitin, and then they say, but what about the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Hanina, where it's missing something? So again, the answer, lo kasha kan b'yom tov rishon, kan b'yom tov sheni. The Mishnah would be talking about only on the first day because it's not complete, but on the subsequent days comes in Rabbi Hanina and says it's not a problem if you eat part of it. Again, a very strange sugya, hard to imagine you could really eat a part of an etrog and still use it for your mitzvah. How Rabbi Hanina did this, we don't really have a good answer. Etrog katan, a very small etrog. Amara from Bar Papa, kemachloket kan kach machloket b'avanim mekor salot. This seems to be a mnemonic device they use to teach you, just like there's a machloket here. There's also machloket about stones on Shabbos. Okay, get ready for this. People used to use stones to wipe themselves in the bathroom. You may remember this from Masechet Shabbat. We learned about this. It's all about, are the stones or the rocks muktzah? Usually you can't use, okay, makor zalot, or they're somewhat, they're not sharp anymore, right? They're sanded down. Generally, rocks are the highest level of muktzah because they have the least use in general. But if they're makor zalot, then they can be used for wiping in the bathroom. The question is, what size do we assume are used for wiping in the bathroom? So Rav from Bar Papa says the same machloket here by etrog katan. If you remember, it's either Rabbi Meir says the size of a walnut, Rabbi Yehuda says the size of an egg. They have the exact same machloket about the size of a stone that you would use for wiping in the bathroom that we allow you to carry, and we override. Now here it seems we could only override. There's a whole distinction in the rabbis. I think it's actually in Rashi. Yeah, Rashi says, Mutar lachnis lebeit hakisei. Okay, that's what we're going to see. Detanya. Let's just read first in the Gemara, and then we'll read in Rashi, as it says in a Braita. B'Shabbat shlosha avanim makor zalot mutar lachnis lebeit hakisei. You can bring them into the bathroom with you. Now, what is the issue? So Rashi says it's not the issue. If we're talking about carrying from one domain to the other, you definitely can't carry them. That's a problem on an Isser to Oraita level. And even if it's something Rabbanit about carrying, most of those things have their roots in Torah prohibition. We're not going to allow it for that. But we're going to allow it, he says, B'toch daled amot, if it's within 4 amot, which is not Asher Mida Oraita. If you're in a field and there's no walls around it, so the question is, what exactly makes this tiltul d'Rabbanan? All different issues. I'm not going to get into all the details, but let's say, for example, are these muktzah? Muktzah is all rabbinic without any root in the Torah. So something rabbinic without any root in the Torah, we're going to override. For what reason? Mishum kavod abriya, lo gazul. Because of this idea that you need to wipe yourself in the bathroom, you don't want to end up going to the bathroom and not having the ability to wipe yourself. It's disgusting, right? Self-respect. We're going to allow you to do something that's rabbinic in nature on Shabbat. What's the size? Now, here's an interesting question. And again, like many things we saw today, there's a total debate about this, which is this, as we saw by etrog, it was the minimum size we were discussing, size of a walnut or size of an egg. Could be obviously be bigger. Are we talking about that this is the minimum size for the stones? And it could even be bigger, but if it's smaller than that, it's not really usable. Some people say that. Some people say it's actually the flip. It's the opposite. This is the maximum size that you would use in the bathroom. Any bigger than that, you wouldn't use in the bathroom. And then you wouldn't use it in the bathroom, then you obviously can't carry it to the bathroom. So is it the exact same machloket and it's the same idea, minimum size? Or is it the opposite, that this is minimum, that's maximum? What's the idea of connecting these two? So first of all, I think the assumption was the etrog was a more known machloket. The stones were less, maybe, or maybe it's the reverse. And this is used as a mnemonic to remember who says what and what the size is that they say, whether it be, again, minimum, or maybe one's minimum, one's maximum size. So again, it's very interesting in today's stuff, and we have this a lot, but that there's sometimes total opposite opinions. And let's forget about commentaries coming in with different explanations. In some of our explanations, the exact opposite. Okay, so now, ubigadol kadesh yochad, right? So then, become a shiuran. So we saw Rabbi Meir says, okay, it goes. Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, it's the exact same thing. Ubigadol kadesh yochaz. The big one, as long as you can hold, right? Remember, we saw the debate between whether it's holding two in one hand, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and according to Rabbi Yossi, even one in two hands, you could still use. So Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yossi. Now remember, throughout the Masechet, we keep having Rabbi Yehuda bringing proof from cases, and the rabbi said to him, you want to prove it from there? Here, he's going to get it the reverse. Rabbi Yossi is going to try to prove it from a situation. He's going to say, what are you talking about? That you can't prove it from there. So Tanya Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Maaseh Rabbi Akiva sheba lebeit hakneset. One day Rabbi Akiva came to the shul, ve'etrogo al ktefo, and his etrog was on his shoulder. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore you see, if he was carrying his etrog on his shoulder, why would you carry things on your shoulder? It's too heavy to carry in your hands. Must be it was a gigantic etrog. Okay, people say he wasn't carrying on his shoulder to fulfill the mitzvah. It was just he was carrying it into the shul because you can't be yotzei the mitzvah by having it on your shoulder. Okay, that's a whole separate thing. But he tries to prove, look, he obviously had a gigantic etrog. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, Misham Raya, you want to prove it from there? Af heinam rulo, you forgot the rest of the situation. The rabbis then said to him, Ein ze hadar, this is not beautiful. This is way too big. It's not nice anymore. You can't use this. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi couldn't prove it from this story because Rabbi Yehuda said you forgot the end of the story. Again, this is like any classic story, two versions of the story. Everybody remembers the parts that they want to remember, or sometimes over time, right? The details get a little bit, embellished, changed, etc. This is how stories pass down. Likewise, halacha gets passed down, right? Sometimes things get lost along the way. New Mishnah. You can't bind a lulav unless it's something with one of the four minim, as we said, right? Or the lulav. Really, it's you use the lulav, something from the palm tree, to bind it. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Meir omer afilu bechut b'mishicha. There's two different ways to read this. Many people read it bechut or b'mishicha. Chut is a string, and mishicha is a cord. Okay, a cord which would be even uglier. Rabbi Meir says it's still okay. Amar Rabbi Meir, and here he further proves it. Maaseh b'anshei Yerushalayim shayu ogdim et lulvehem begimniot shel zahav. The Anshe Yerushalayim, which are the same ones that carry their lulav and etrog with them all day, would use gold thread to wrap around to bind it with, to make it look beautiful. So that's clearly not the same type. Amrulo, they said to him, that's not a proof. Bimino hayu ogdim oto milamata. Underneath, now whether that means they would put the binding, somehow underneath, we'll talk about two options of underneath, they would put the regular binding, and that would be the fulfillment of the mitzvah. And then they would add this nice gold adornment, but it wasn't the eged itself. The eged itself has to be with the same type. That's just something additional, which is clear. It's not really part of the mitzvah. What does it mean underneath? Some people say there was the binding, and on top of it was, right, higher up on the lulav was this gold binding. Some people say it actually covered the eged, and that right underneath was the palm, and then wrapped around that was this gold tie. Okay, it doesn't have such major relevance, at least not in my mind. Maybe there is. Amar Rava, and this is something we saw before. What can you use? Afilu b'siv, afilu b'ikra dedikla. Right, even if you use, or b'ikra dedikla, even if you use the fibers of the palm tree, or the trunk of the palm tree, which doesn't look the same. Remember, we had this whole thing, isn't it? He needs it the same type so it matches and it looks beautiful. And then we said, no. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't need beauty by lulav. Remember, it's only because of this Baal Tosif issue. And then Rava, they prove it from Rava, because here, if you use the fibers or you use the trunk, it doesn't look the same. It doesn't have this nice look to it. Why does he hold this way? Kasavar lulav tzarich eged, because he holds that eged is part of the mitzvah. And if you bring something else, you'll end up with 5 minim, and we don't want to have 5 minim. But now Rava says, and we're not going to actually finish this today. How do we know that this these two things, parts of the palm tree, meaning, right, normally we use part of the lulav to bind it, but he's saying you could even use things from the palm tree, other parts of it. How do we know that that's considered the lulav? Titania, as it says in a Braita, B'Sukkot Teshvu, you're going to find an interesting halacha here. Sukkah shel kol davar divrei Rabbi Meir. Your sukkah can be made up of any kind of material. Okay, again, there's some rules about Pesach, what, it has to be not susceptible to impurity, all those, but it could be used, right? You can sit in a sukkah made of anything. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ein sukkah noheget ela ba'arba'a minim shebelulav. You can only use things that could be used for the 4 species. Only build your sukkah with those materials. Okay, where does he get this from? A very interesting kal vachomer. Okay, v'hadin noten. This is where you can really use kal vachomers for all sorts of things. Uma lulav she'eino noheg balelot kibiyamim eino noheg ela ba'arbaat minim. Lulav has a certain leniency as compared to sukkah because you're not obligated in it at night like you are in the day, only during the day. And yet you only have 4 species that you can use. Sukkah, Sukkah, it must be more stringent because it is during the day and at night. Wouldn't you then assume that also you can only use the 4 species for it? Amrulo, they said to him, what are you talking about? You want to be stringent on the sukkah and require 4 meaning, but you're going to end up causing a huge leniency. Now, not exactly a leniency, but you're going to really cause problems by doing this. Why? Okay. And you're going to create a situation where people aren't going to sit in a sukkah because if you don't find, let's say you don't have the materials, it's not so easy to find all these species to basically build your sukkah from them. So they say, the Torah says, sit in your sukkah 7 days, and you're going to end up not sitting in your sukkah 7 days. So therefore, it must be you can use anything, and that's their retort to Rabbi Yehuda, who wanted to build your sukkah with the 4 species. Okay. Now I just want to check one thing. So we're going to get more into this tomorrow. We didn't really show how Rav approves his case from here. Remember, Rav is trying to prove, how do I know you can use the sieve and the ikara didikla? Okay. But yeah, so actually, I wanted to check this. It seems that we're talking about the mitzvah of sukkah, of building the schach, not the walls, but the schach itself has to be from one of the 4 minim, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So work well for people who use palm fronds. Wouldn't work as well for people who use wood and other things, right, on their roof or what, or straw thing, all different materials that people use, bamboo, right, for their sukkah. This wouldn't work for them. Okay, we're going to even prove it from Pasuk, Rabbi Yehuda's position. Anyway, we're going to get into all this tomorrow, and we'll see how Rav proves his position from this source. Okay, have a great day, everyone. We will pick up tomorrow.